I've been talking about Anselm on freedom of the will. We've noted his definition of freedom of the will as the power to keep justice, which, in other words, in his own words, is the capacity to preserve the rectitude of the will for the sake of that very rectitude. In other words, it's the power to preserve the rightness of the will for its own sake, for the sake of that rightness. So, what does that really amount to? What is that conception of liberty in the end, and how does it really fit into an overall theological picture? I've given some hints about that, but I want to develop that much more fully because Anselm gives us a powerful account of what the will is like and what our desires in particular truly are. I think it's a subtle account, and it's one that tells us a lot about the nature of the battle within us between acting well and acting badly, between sinning and not sinning, between, you might say, overcoming weakness of will and succumbing to it, giving in to temptation and resisting it. All of those things center on the nature of the will and the nature of our power to pursue rectitude for its own sake. So let's think about how all of this goes. Anselm holds that we have two basic desires. You could describe it as maybe two wills that are intrinsic to us. The idea here is basically that we have a fundamental desire for happiness. To this extent, Aristotle is right. Everyone by nature pursues happiness. That is something we value for itself and only for itself. And so that's something that is important. We do want to be happy. We strive to be happy. But is that everything? Anselm says no. That is not the only thing that we pursue for its own sake. Also in us is a will toward justice, a will toward rectitude for its own sake. In other words, it's not only intrinsic to us that we strive to be happy for its own sake. We also want to do the right thing for its own sake. So I am intrinsically a being that pursues happiness, but I also pursue goodness. I also want to be a good person. I want to do the right thing, and not because it benefits me in some way, because it makes me happy, because it's right. I want to be the kind of person who does the right thing for the right reason, who does the right thing because it's right. But now, how do those two things go together? You can see immediately that there's a possibility of conflict. And so you might think, aha, I see. There are these two basic desires, and they can come into conflict. I've got a desire for happiness. I also have a desire to do the right thing. But sometimes it looks to me as if I'll be happier if I don't do the right thing. And so now I'm in a situation of moral conflict. I have one will opposing the other will. It's a bit like the Platonic picture of having a fight between desire, emotion, and reason, except here I only have the two parts, the desire for happiness and the desire to do the right thing. I've got something like what the Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi describes as the moral mind and the natural mind. The natural mind seeks happiness, the moral mind seeks to do the right thing for the right reason, and they can easily come into conflict. Life is a battle between those two wills, those two minds, the natural and the moral mind. But things are more complicated for a couple of reasons. One is that, after all, that desire for justice, that desire to do the right thing for the right reason, isn't just something that inclines me to do the wrong thing. It may incline me to do the right thing for the wrong reason. So I might, for example, think that doing this will in fact make me happy, and I do it for that reason. I might be doing the right thing, but I'm not doing it for the right reason. Something like Kant's shopkeeper, who is honest with customers because he thinks it's good business, not because he thinks it's the right thing to do. In that case, Kant says, that action has no real moral worth. To put it in Anselm's terms, that's not really something that reveals a rectitude of the will. It's something that doesn't really stem from a desire for justice. It stems simply from the desire for happiness. But the complication goes much deeper than that. In Anselm, the desire for justice, for the rectitude of the will for its own sake, is not simply a competing desire. It is something that acts as a sort of higher order desire. I want to pursue happiness in a way that actually involves me in doing the right thing for the right reason. In other words, I want this to be something like a regulation on my pursuit of happiness. I want to be able to pursue happiness, but I want to do it in the right way. Now, what is the right way? Well, sin is a matter of willing what I should not will, doing what I should not do, but really you might say choosing what I should not choose to do. And so it's a matter of willing what I shouldn't. Well, what should I be willing? I should be willing what God wills me to will. And so we could say, I see. So rectitude of the will is a matter of willing what God wills me to will, and also willing that I will what God wills me to will. And now, once I see that, I realize that this is a bit complicated. It's not just a question of the pursuit of happiness versus the pursuit of goodness. It's rather that I have to pursue happiness within the bounds, you might say, of willing what God wills me to will. So I want to, and I will, to be happy. However, I have to restrain that will so that it accords with God's will. And in that way, you might say, it's not just a battle of this kind, one will opposed to another will. It's one will at a higher level looking down at the other will and saying, but, wait a minute, Now, and here we have a divergence from Augustine, and I'll get to that in a moment. Augustine would say, yes, I'm looking down on that will, and sometimes I will not to will that. And I may win that battle or I may lose that battle, but now I have my higher order will saying, I don't will to will that. And the lower order will saying, but I do will that. Something like the person trying to resist temptation. I will to give in to temptation, but I don't want to will that. I don't will to will that, and so I will unwillingly, Augustine says. As we'll see, that is not Anselm's account. There is something similar in that it's a higher order willing going on, but it is a matter of willing to will what God wills me to will, and that is going to have a rather different character, as we'll see. Now, if all of this is right, this is a complicated and somewhat scary picture, not just because of all the willing going on, it's because of the regulative nature of our will to justice, of our desire for justice. It's a matter of willing to will what God wills us to will. And that's a complicated thing. There's several questions that arise here. For one thing, how do I know what God wills me to will? The second problem is, how do I even know, not just what I'm willing, presumably I know what I'm choosing, but the reason I'm choosing it? Do I know whether I'm willing it for the right reason because it's something that I think God wills me to will, or is it something I'm willing because I will to be happy? Is it some combination of those? Am I, moreover, making a mistake? Is that something that I think I'm doing for the right reason and I'm not? Maybe it's not the right thing to do at all. It's what I shouldn't be doing. It's something other than what God would will me to will. All of that is tricky. As Anselm's student interlocutor says in Why God Became Man, we live very dangerously. At any point, we may be doing the wrong thing. We may be doing the right thing for the wrong reason. We may be wrong even about what's going to lead to happiness. So we can make mistakes again and again. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is Socrates' picture, that therefore weakness of will or doing the wrong thing are a result of ignorance. No, that's not true. It's a question of a legitimate pursuit of happiness, going off the rails, going out of the bounds that our desire for justice ought to be establishing. And it's very easy for that to happen. So in short, we live very, very dangerously. And of course, even more so, once we have given ourselves up to sin, we've enslaved ourselves to sin, then there is actually no way for us to regain the rectitude. We still have the power in us to preserve it if we were given it, but we've lost it and we can't get it back. So in all of these ways, we live very dangerously. Now let's think carefully about what is lost in the fall, what we've given up through sin. Is it that internal, subjective ability to maintain justice? No, we still have that. It's something like the person going to Denver that I talked about in the other video. Will they have the ability to see the Rockies? They still have their innate ability to see, assuming they have it in the first place. And so closing their eyes doesn't take that away. Standing behind a building that's blocking their view is not taking that away. But there are other things. They have to be pointed in the right direction where there really are mountains. The air has to be clear enough for them to see the mountain. And moreover, there has to be nothing in the way. So we have to have the ability not only to see, but then to exercise that power of sight toward an object that really is there in that direction and that is accessible to us, which is not blocked by any obstacle, any defeater. Now apply that to sin. By enslaving ourselves to sin, we still retain that inner power to preserve rectitude. The problem is we have no rectitude to preserve. We've lost that. We've lost that ability to actually exercise our innate ability. Now that sounds paradoxical. What do you mean? I've lost the ability to exercise my ability. Doesn't that mean losing the ability? Not really. I have the ability to play the harpsichord, for example, but I don't have access to a harpsichord right now. And so you might say, well, do I have the ability to play the harpsichord? Yeah, if I had a harpsichord to play, but I don't. So I've lost the ability to actually, now I've never owned a harpsichord, so it's not like I had that ability. A better analogy would be as if I used to have one and then I got rid of it, I gave it away. The situation of the sinner is like that. They could, in theory, preserve the rectitude of the will if they had a rectitude to preserve, but they don't anymore. They gave it away. And so we have to keep in mind what's going on there. What have they lost? Have they lost that ability to preserve rectitude if they had it? No, they still have that. Have they lost the power of choosing? No, they can still make choices. That's how they sin. Have they lost the desire for happiness? No. What they've lost is that desire for justice, the desire to preserve rectitude for its own sake. So what's happened is that one of those conditions, those 4 ways in which the will gets involved here, has gone wrong, has been given up, has been lost. They still have the power to retain rectitude, if they had any to preserve. They still have the will to happiness. They still have the ability to make choices, but they've lost the will to justice, the will to rectitude for its own sake. Now that's what they can't get back. But can't I want to get it back? Can't I be convinced, look, I've lost something. I need to, under my own power, get it back? No, can't do it. Why not? Because I would have to will the rectitude of the will. But that's just to will the rectitude of the will, and that's to have the rectitude in the first place. So in other words, I can't regenerate that desire. I can't will the rectitude of the will for its own sake, because that's just to will it. That's just to have it. So in other words, I can't will rectitude without already having it. Consequently, this is not something I can get out of. I've got to have outside help. Just as the voluntary slave cannot just decide to be free. A desire for freedom won't cut it. They have to be freed by someone else. And we're in that position with respect to sin. We need somebody externally who can do that. But who can do it? The price we've set on ourselves, as he explains it why God became man, is actually an infinite price. Only someone capable of paying that infinite price could free us. Only God can do that through the gift of grace. But that also explains why the incarnation was necessary, because it would only be just for someone to do that if they were fully human as well. So, only a being that is fully divine and fully human could not only pay the price of freeing us, but could also do that in a way that does accord with justice. Well, as I've said, we cannot do this ourselves. A desire for justice would just be a desire for justice. And so it would presuppose the very thing we are desiring. I can't simply desire rectitude and go after it because I would already have to have rectitude to be able to have that desire. So it requires something outside of me. And so to that extent, the Pelagians are wrong. Pelagius is wrong to say we can do this on our own, that we have the capacity to actually live the good life and to earn salvation. It's not true. We can't do it ourselves. It requires an outside power to free us from the slavery we have subjugated ourselves to. But that is not to say, as Augustine says, that therefore it requires God's grace and only God's grace. No, something is required of us as well. We have to actually maintain that rectitude. We can't get back the rectitude we surrendered on our own, but it is our problem to preserve that. Now, we still have that inner capacity, the power to keep justice, the power to preserve the rectitude of the will once we have it. So when God gives us the gift of grace and restores our rectitude, we retain the power now to preserve it, to maintain it, to keep it. But it's not automatic. It is not irresistible, as Augustine and Calvin think. No, grace is something that requires us actively to preserve it. So let me give you an analogy. You're in a dark mansion. There is no light anywhere, and you're stumbling from room to room. All the rooms are completely dark. And you're puzzled. You don't know how you're going to get out of here. You don't understand how you'll ever find your way out. In the mansion are the materials for producing light. There are lamps. There are matches to light the lamps. And so it is actually possible to get out of there, to light something that will enable you to find your way out. But how is that going to happen? We can now explain various approaches to the theological question of freedom of the will and sin and grace on the basis of that little analogy. Augustine has a view that relies on God's predestination. He basically says before all this starts, God has decided to light the lamps in certain rooms. So God lights the lamps. We just have to then go outside. Okay? And once we have the lamp, no reason for us to blow it out. We're going to naturally go outside, no problem. Pelagius says God has given the materials there. The lamps and the matches are there in the mansion somewhere. We have to find them, and then we have to light the lamp and find our way out ourselves. There was a position known as semi-Pelagianism. The term didn't arise until the 16th or 17th century, at least. But on the other hand, there were people advocating this much earlier, shortly after the controversy between Augustine and Pelagius. And the view here is that we have to find the match and the lamp and light the lamp, but then God will help to preserve the flame and help the flame grow so that we can see our way out. Anselm has, in a way, exactly the opposite view from that semi-Pelagianism. Here's the idea. God has indeed put the lamps and the matches in the room. God lights them for us and hands us the lit lamp. But we have to preserve the flame on the way out. There are drafts in here. And actually, some of us like the darkness and have gotten used to it and actually find ourselves happier in the dark. Think about Plato's vision of the light at first as you try to climb those stairs being bright and blinding and you don't like it. So some look at the lit lamp and want to look away and say, no, they blow it out. Some leave it behind. Some fail to preserve it, and so they allow the flame to go out. They allow the drafts to affect it, and they lose the light on the way. That's Anselm's picture. God restores through grace the rectitude of the will. That's equivalent to lighting the lamp for us. But then we have to maintain the flame. We have to preserve that. We have the power to preserve it. We can do it. But on the other hand, some of us choose freely not to do it. Others freely choose to do it. So what's required for salvation, for leading the right kind of life, for triumphing over temptation and restoring virtue, therefore, is, yes, the gift of God's grace, but then also our act of preserving it, our choice freely to preserve it. So there is an element of free will here, but also an element of grace. Neither is sufficient on its own. Grace isn't sufficient on its own. We actually have to preserve the rectitude that God has given us. But on the other hand, free choice is not sufficient either. We have to have God's grace, not only in giving us the raw materials, but in lighting the lamp for us. Because it's in the dark. We can't even find it, let alone light the lamp ourselves. God does that part for us.